Hey guys, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. And today we're going to be taking a look at a knife that is interesting and different and from a company that I could probably not possibly have less interest in. I don't hate every single thing that they do, but anyway, we are looking today at the James brand, the Barnes. There is the knife we're talking about. There's a lot I want to cover here, but before I do that, let me just say a little bit about James brand. It's a James brand is a brand that doesn't excite me all that much. You know, I've spent a bit of time on their website, both in preparation for this and earlier when this was coming out, to kind of see what the prices were and availability. They have this knife and they have the Carter, both of which the design is somewhat compelling. But you know, the Carter is another example where I'm like, hey, that's kind of a neat looking knife. Let me go check out how much it would cost me to pick one up. And as soon as I saw the price, I was like, yeah, that's a hard pass. Anyway, they're sort of a boutique style, fancy, pretentious brand. You know, they're marketing to the, you know, beard comb crowd, who, you know, the guys who dress like lumberjacks but would complain about the weight if they ever picked up an axe in real life. They wear Carhartts, but they never pick up anything heavier than, you know, their Starbucks coffee or maybe an expensive craft beer that tastes terrible because it's got way too much hops. Anyway, these guys love James brand, or James brand hopes that these guys will love them, and they sort of devise their marketing around that. And, you know, this is kind of in keeping with that. It's boutique priced, it's, you know, it's minimalist with a little bit of a twist. And they, you know, again, they do have some knives there that aren't terrible, although pretty much all of them, I did spend some time looking through their catalog. Pretty much everything that they have is, you know, for the price point, is going to be, you know, overpriced. There'd be another knife out there that does the same thing, or maybe even does something better for less money. And so that's one of the real challenges that that I feel like I'm dealing with here. Now, having said all that negative stuff, I have to say, if you do want some James brand stuff, Thunderbird Gear is a great place to go and get it. You don't, Steve has a bunch of their stuff. It's already in Canada. You don't have to worry about it crossing the border. You don't have to worry about some of that, that stress. And the other thing is, by the way, let me just make this comment. You know, so I talked to Steve over at Thunderbird Gear, and he sent me a bunch of stuff for review. And this is what's great about working with a retailer rather than a manufacturer. With a manufacturer, you know, if James Brand had sent me this knife, yeah, there's a certain amount of pressure there to, you know, say something good. Now, and you know, one way or the other, okay, it's going to affect me. You know, I've seen reviewers who get stuff and I think, you know, man, they're being really, really hard on that particular item, way harder than they usually are. And I attribute that to the fact that it was free and they're trying to offset their favorable bias. And on the other hand, I've watched reviewers who are hesitant to say anything negative. And, you know, you sort of have to read between the lines to figure out that they really don't like this item. And again, I think it's because they don't want to ruin the relationship they have with a manufacturer to get more items in the future, because that is, you know, one of the challenges of having a YouTube channel where you're doing product stuff. You know, you can't just be buying all this stuff all the time. I mean, most people can't anyway, myself included. So this is a really nice, so working with retailers, you know, you guys know, very well attested that I usually get stuff from White Mountain Knives. I really like Justin. I really like White Mountain Knives. I also from time to time get stuff from Steve over at Thunderbird Gear. And again, I like Steve. I like Thunderbird Gear. Not all of the stuff he carries is totally up my alley, but guess what? Not all the stuff any retailer carries is totally up my alley. But it does give me a chance to review something like this that I would never personally buy, and maybe that I'm not even totally in in love with, and I can be totally honest about it. If I love this, I can love it. If I hate it, I can hate it. If I'm somewhere in between, I can be somewhere in between and still recommend the retailer, right? Because this is not made by Thunderbird Gear. It just happens to be one of the things that they carry. So it allows me, I find, to be a little more objective. All right, let's get this box out of the way and let me, quit lecturing you and preaching at you about this stuff. Oh, I should point out they do send a coin along with this. Sorry, let me move this out of the way. So in the box, we have a microfiber cloth. That's where the knife normally goes. And we've got this James Brand sort of challenge coin in the box. All right. And they say that's because of the tradition that if you give someone a knife, there should always be a coin that is part of the exchange. All right. So let's bring this back in and let me talk a little bit more specifically about the knife itself. First of all, this design is very clean and I do kind of appreciate it. There are a few things here that I think are pretty good. First of all, just the design in general, it's clean, it's simple, it's attractive. The milling here adds a touch of detail and visual interest without becoming like noisy and overbearing. Even the lock side, this is one of those knives, and I love knives that do this. This is one of those knives where the lock side is equally as attractive or maybe even more attractive than the show side. I think that's a win for sure. And finally, this is built by Riot, which again is a win. Now, I will say, given that that fact will come up in a second, but before we get to, some of this does remind me of some of the other Riot knives that I have handled. All right. So the design is impressive. The construction, this is a full integral. Again, very impressive. So I've got to give credit where credit is due, despite some of the stuff I said about James Brand, and I was being a little facetious there. But whatever you may think of them, even if you hate them more than with the intensity of the sun, that type of thing, this is a nice design. And it's very well put together, and it's a pretty interesting idea. So you have to give credit where credit is due. Before we'll touch on some of those details in a bit greater, or we'll touch on some of those aspects in greater detail in just a minute. Before we do that, quick rundown on size and weight: 7 7/8 overall, 3 3/8 on the blade length, 4 7/16 closed. Okay, so under 4.5 inches when closed. 3 7/8 grip area, which is actually a pretty generous amount of grip. You can see it in a hammer grip anyway, it feels pretty good. Now, if I put my finger here on the jimping, that does push me back a little bit. We'll talk about that under ergonomics. But there's a reasonable, like, it's not a huge knife, but it's not small. And so, I'd call this a fairly full-size knife. The weight on this is 4.6 ounces, which, an integral, you've got a solid billet of titanium here, which is going to add a bit of weight, but not that bad. Okay, so, I'm not going to complain about 4.6 ounces. I really, as you guys know, anything under 7 ounces, I really don't care about the weight that much. All right, so yeah, we've got a full-size knife. It's on the smaller end of a full size. Like anything under 8 inches, I think of as a little bit on the smaller side, but not bad. Pretty nice size. I can see most people being kind of okay with this. All right, moving on to the blade. We've talked about size, weight, and from that perspective, it's fine. The blade here is a bit more of a discussion. The details are pretty nice. It's M390 steel. We've got a blasted finish on the primary bevel. Secondary bevel there is quite thin, which makes this cut which would make this cut pretty well. Nice satin finish on the flats, and then interesting way of doing, like, you would look at this and think that this is just a flat or maybe a crown spine, but as you turn it up here, you can see, check that out, they've done a swedge on the top of this, but a very aggressive swedge, which is pretty cool. Actually kind of a nice touch. These obviously bright green thumb studs, which even if I hadn't mentioned them, you'd be hard pressed to miss. The blade is it definitely leans toward the hard use end of the spectrum. Look at how much material. It's a thick grind. It carries a lot of material out to the tip. It's a fairly abrupt flat grind here. So there's a lot of material here. Yes, it's thinner behind the edge. You know, you wouldn't want to be doing your fine slicing with this, but for most EDC tasks, it's going to be just fine. And, you know, well, it's not the most slicey thing in the world. It's adequate for sure. And especially for EDC tasks. Like, a slicey blade is important for food prep, but that's kind of it. Like most other things, you're fine. I guess cardboard cutting a slicey blade is good, but I don't anticipate a lot of people grabbing this knife and going out and cutting down all the cardboard in their garage. Maybe some will, and you know, because of that extra thickness, it's going to be a little tougher to push through the material. But cardboard is not that bad to cut. Like you can, you know what I mean? I'm not going to take away a lot of points for that. The blade is definitely leaning toward the harder use end of the you know, the balance point here. If you go really thin and slicey on this point and really, you know, a sharpened pry bar on this point, you know, this knife is a little to this side of the balance. But it's still great as an EDC blade. Okay, moving on to the action. So this is on bearings. It's a titanium frame lock, as everyone can see. We've got a lock bar insert there. Thumb stud deployment is the only deployment option. And honestly, this feels to me a lot like some other Riot knives that I've had, especially feels like the Chavez knives that are built by Riot. If you felt one of those, then you have a really good idea about what this feels like. The detent is a little stiff. You got to keep your fingers off the lock bar, but if you do, it's quite enjoyable. So that's the lockup. Lockup, of course, is quite solid, as you can see there. And there's two things I want to mention here. One, I like the way that they've done this lock bar insert. It kind of wraps in around the lock bar. There we go. Sorry, I couldn't get it to focus. Kind of wraps in around the lock bar there, which is a nice way of doing this when you're dealing with an integral, because you can't really reach in there and screw it on from this side. The other thing I really want to mention is the pivot construction. This is a really nice way of doing this. The knives where, you know, they try to bend this out and shove everything in there like the line steels do, and like Spyderco has done and a couple others, like that's not the best approach. This sort of sandwich construction where this big plate holds everything in place, this is really, really nicely done because it allows you to do the pivot properly. You don't have to make a lot of compromises. You can put proper bearing races in here. You can put proper ceramic caged bearings in here. All of that is not a problem if you do it this way. If you try and do it the other way, you end up compromising, which I just don't like. I don't want to deal with those compromises. So I really like this way of doing the pivot, not to mention it looks kind of cool as well. While we're talking about, you know, so that's the action, the way it's achieved and built. It is only a T6, pretty fine little guy there. Little bigger on this side. So you see that again. So that's about all I've got to say about action here. Finally, let's look at the rest of the way this is constructed. So I'm really happy with the way the pivot is constructed. Of course, the integral is cool. The texturing is fantastic. This feels really, really good and tactile in hand, very confidence inspiring. We've got an integrated lanyard attachment point that's part of this clip, which is really, really cool. The clip does work very well. It's a milled titanium clip, but it's got a bit of spring to it. It goes in and out of pocket nicely. And notice this detail. This is something that Spyderco's been doing for a while, and it's good of James Brand to notice this. So underneath, that is flat so that this slides in and out of pocket, no problem. Imagine if this texturing was sliding in and out of your pocket, it would eat your pockets up like a cold steel is wont to do. So that's a nice touch. You can see the screw there that holds the pocket clip in place. So I have to say construction is equally impressive to design. And those are the big standouts here, right? The two things that really you have to give a lot of credit to this knife for doing are, number one, having a really attractive design, and number two, having fantastic build quality and attention to detail. So, you know, guys, those things I just love. In terms of practical matters, you know, I would probably like this a little better if it was a hollow grind. the ergonomics are okay. It's a little, what happens is you can see how this creates a bump here. So my thumb is kind of forced to be behind this bump. So in a saber grip, it moves everything back, and it means I've got to back off here, which makes it not as comfortable as perhaps it could be if it was just a little bit bigger, or if they just made this flat. All right, and allowed me to have my thumb all the way up to here. You know, if I just kind of ignore this and put it up here, when I'm not cutting anything, this feels okay. You know, and by the way, I didn't go and do a bunch of cutting with this because it's an item to be sold, so it needs to be like brand new, which it will be when I send it back to Steve. All right, so in terms of the practical points, the blade is yeah, a little thick. The ergonomics are only okay. Probably a lot of people that are buying this are not buying it for as purely a cutting tool. They're buying it for some of the other attributes that it brings, such as the design, the cool integral construction. Those kind of things probably stand out to people a little bit more. Now, I want to bring in some comparisons here because one of the things that needs to be noted about this is the price point. This is not a cheap knife, okay? And being that it's built by Riot, you know, you can get this knife, which is it has features that are actually a little bit better, materials that are just as good, and to me, you know, kind of fits my needs a little bit better overall. Like this is a really nicely done knife, and you can pick one of these up on the secondary market for like $225, and they've even had sales for, you know, $325 and less, where you could pick one of these up. So that's one of the things I think is an issue to me, is the price of this. All right, here is an Arno Bernard Imamba, and this knife costs less than this, despite the fact that this is like handmade personal workmanship. It's not just made in some Chinese factory. Like this is a person, a skilled craftsman is putting these together one by one. And you know, that's pretty crazy when this knife costs less than this one. Okay, so that I think has to be considered in this discussion as well. Finally, let's throw in a Sebenza. I know we're getting a little long in the tooth here in terms of time frame. So there's a Sebenza. Yeah, honestly, guys, for the price point, I don't hate this knife. It's got some cool stuff going on, but would I take this over any of these, or would I recommend you buy this over any of these? No. All right. However, two of these are available at Thunderbird Gear. So I do want to give Steve some attention in this video and thank him for sending this to me and allowing me to spend some time with it and get a review done. But if you're going to go over to Thunderbird Gear and buy something, I would lean toward one of these, or maybe some of the other options that he has there, rather than dropping the significant dollars that it's going to cost you to get into a Barnes. All right, thanks a lot for watching, guys. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and we will talk to you soon.